Dr. Prentice I somehow or another managed to make a friend of him early on in my career with the pro-life movement, and he has been my go-to guy since probably about 2002. Every time I would come into a situation where I didn't understand the ethics or the medical process that they were talking about, I would send Dr. David questions, and he would clarify and make sense of it for me. So he's with the Charlotte Lozier Institute. He's a great guy. He's wearing the coolest boots in town. He had a great line for him. What did you say?
It's the best use of a snake I can think of.
So, with no further ado, Dr. Prentice, please take over.
Thanks so much, Georgette. And thank you, Johnston, and especially Leslie for the prayer cover. Thank you all for having me here. We're going to take a little diversion here. This may not be something you're usually used to talking about in terms of the life issue, good, the bad, and the ugly of science and of bioethics. What a lot of my colleagues call weird science, but things that you need to be aware of because these are also part of the life issue, and you need to be aware of them and be able to fight back against the bad and the ugly, but also to push the good. Now, for scientists, bioethics, if I could have the next slide, please. For scientists, a lot of us, ethics doesn't matter. You know, I find it harder and harder to get any work done with all the ethicists hanging around. Usually don't think about that. I'm just doing science, right? But there is a lot of emphasis on ethics, and scientists need to be considering that, especially when it comes to human beings and anything that might involve creation and destruction of human life. If I could have the next slide, please. You know, the basic science reaffirms that you and I are human beings of value. This is from one of the two leading scientific journals in the world, Nature. 2002, Your Destiny from Day One, and it talks about how you were a human being, from conception. So the biology is actually there. It's in the ethical interpretation of whether you have any intrinsic dignity or human value where all of the debate comes from. Next slide, please. I'm going to pitch some resources for you because we're going to be moving fast. We're going to cover a lot of territory. So please, if you have questions afterwards, we can talk. But you can also go to our website, lozierinstitute.org. We've got a whole lot of resources, not just about weird science, but about the whole life issue that you can go to. Next slide, please. And one of those is The Voyage of Life. It's a very unique resource that you can go to, and essentially the scientific facts and details about your journey from that single-celled individual up to birth. Now, being a geek, one of the coolest things I like is if you scroll down, you'll see this little baby develop as you go down the page, and then you can scroll back and the baby goes back and it keeps developing. But please check all this stuff out. Next slide, please. So we're going to start talking about fetal tissue and fetal cells, things from abortion. Where do you get those? Well, death of an embryo or death of a fetus. You actually have to destroy a human life to get fetal tissue, fetal stem cells, embryonic stem cells. Next slide, please. Reasons that we've been given that, we have to do fetal tissue research. Well, a number of these you've probably heard, well, it's legally obtained. I mean, we've already heard how if something's legal, sometimes it's just considered ethical. Certainly not the case here because, again, you rely on the destruction of a human being to get these research materials. Otherwise you're just going to throw it away. What a waste. Oh, dear. It's already led to major medical advances. There are 0 people, by the way, who have been cured using fetal tissue. It makes better humanized mice. I'll describe what those are in a little bit. Fetal tissue is flexible. If there were better alternatives, researchers would turn to them. Yeah, not really. I'm a bench researcher. A lot of us are very hidebound. If you've got something you've been using, you just keep using it. Even if there's something much better and certainly ethical that would get, those mean old pro-lifers off your back. A lot of times you just keep doing the same thing. Oh, it adapts to new environment, basic biology. You can't replicate this with adult tissue. Also wrong. Next slide, please. You might have seen David Daleidon's videos a number of years ago where he went into Planned Parenthood clinics undercover and disclosed all of the trafficking in baby body parts that was going on. One thing that also came out from David's investigations was the informed consent forms that they were using to get the women to agree to give up their baby and have her parted out for research. This one really struck home. Research using fetal tissue has been used to treat and find a cure for diseases like diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cancer, and AIDS. Obviously not true. I don't know of any cure for any of these yet, and certainly nothing with fetal tissue. But this idea of trying to force someone to give up their baby because some good might come out of it. Next slide, please. It's a little bit like in Calvin and Hobbes is one of my favorite cartoons. So Hobbes, the tiger, is going, "Aren't you supposed to be doing homework?" He says, "Oh, I've decided that homework is bad for my self-esteem." Sure, it sends a message, I don't know enough. All that emphasis on right answers makes me feel bad when I get them wrong, so instead of trying to learn, I'm just going to concentrate on liking myself the way I am. And so your self-esteem is enhanced by being an ignoramus. Please, let's call it informationally impaired. Well, I don't want you to be informationally impaired. I want you to know not just about fetal tissue, but about a number of these ethical challenges, but also about the good, the alternatives that are not only ethical, but are successful. Next slide, please. So in terms of the fetal tissue fight, for years and years and years, we'd been trying to get this information out there. The Trump administration finally listened to us and actually canceled a lot of taxpayer funding for aborted fetal tissue to stop a lot of that trafficking. Next slide, please. Congressional hearings where we testified, writing op-eds, writing scientific papers, holding congressional briefings, again, trying to get the truth and the facts out there just about fetal tissue and the research involved. Next slide, please. Full disclosure, I got appointed to the Federal Ethics Advisory Board where we reviewed a bunch of these fetal tissue grant proposals, where they were proposing to use aborted baby body parts for research. We rejected almost all of them just on an ethical basis. And the other part of this that most people don't even hear is simply that there were pro-abortion fetal tissue researchers on that panel with me. About 1/3 of the proposals were rejected unanimously, meaning even the fetal tissue researchers could see there were ethical problems going on. Maybe a little spirit working on their conscience and so on. Next slide, please. And then along came the Biden administration and put us out of a job and restored a bunch of the funding. Now, they didn't restore it all, so standing in front of that Mack truck did give some results in terms of continuing to decrease the funding, but there's a lot of work yet to do in that area. Next slide, please. And again, I want to point out ethical alternatives. So I talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly of science and bioethics. There are a great number of actually successful alternatives to aborted baby body parts in research, whether those are stem cells, whether there's the cord blood and the placenta after the baby's born that have been used, surgery and tissues and organs that have been removed, even pediatric organs after the baby has had, or the newborn has had some surgery. Many of those can be used, and they've actually been successful compared to the fetal tissue. The humanized mice up there kind of in the right corner, the idea there is that you put a human immune system into a mouse. We're not talking about making Mickey Mouse and he's walking and talking. But the idea then you've got a human immune system so you can do these tests of drugs and so on the mouse and not on the people. Well, the claim has always been, well, you have to use human aborted fetal tissue to get this to happen. It's simply not true. Next slide. we actually came across a paper from 2018 where they had used, again, some of those surgical cast-offs from newborn surgeries. Turned out using the ethical source was 50 times better in terms of the mice that were made, and they were actually more clinically relevant to doing these particular studies. Again, failing on fetal tissue, succeeding on the ethical alternatives. Next slide, please. You've probably seen this little picture of Samuel Armas getting surgery, fetal surgery inside. Samuel was about 19 weeks gestational age at this point. I actually got to meet with Samuel a few years ago. He's now in his 20s, just a delightful young man. But the idea that you consider this patient instead of a source for your research materials. And there are now thousands of fetal surgeries going on in the US alone. So my colleagues actually wrote this little paper to disclose all of these called the Perinatal Revolution. A lot of this going on, but again, here's a patient, not a source of raw materials. Next slide, please. And this is, again, the source that they're talking about, the little baby still unborn, taking out her organs, parting her out like you'd part out a used car. Sometimes they will take those tissues, put the cells into a dish, and start to grow what's called a cell line. In other words, the lineage starts from there. You can keep cells growing in culture sometimes for years and years and years. You can do it with fetal tissue, and we've actually written up a whole geeky scientific paper on that too, if you're ever interested in something that'll put you to sleep at night. Next slide, please. But cell cultures can be made from adult tissue as well, and from ethical sources. You can simply take some of these tissues or cells, put them in the dish. There on the right, you see the cells growing in the dish, and all the success, again, has come from the ethical sources, not from parting out baby body parts. Next slide, please. And these are actually some of my cells from blood. My students took, I think, too much joy in playing what they called bleed the professor. But they would take some blood and grow my blood stem cells in the dish. And you could do experiments with that. And again, it's much more successful than the fetal or the embryonic cells. Next slide, please. So in speaking of embryonic stem cells, this really characterized where the debate was. I died waiting for embryonic stem cell research to find a cure. What about you? I was the embryo. And early on in this debate, those were your only two choices, right? You either killed embryos or you let patients die, because the mantra was only embryonic stem cells were going to cure people of all of these diseases. Had one US senator tell me that embryonic stem cells had the potential to cure all known maladies. I'm thinking, what about dandruff? Next slide. So anyway, you get embryonic stem cells, though, from embryos. You have to kill a young human being. Now, much earlier, 5 to 7 days old, you break her apart and put her cells into the dish. You can use embryos made the old-fashioned way, egg and sperm. We call that fertilization. You might have heard of it. But you can also make embryos new ways, like cloning. Somatic cell nuclear transfer being the fancy thing. Bottom line is, you still have an early member of the human species here whose life you end just to harvest their cells. But there are other ways. Induced pluripotent stem cells, which is a mouthful, so we just say iPS cells. These are cells that you can make starting with a normal cell, and then you do a little genetic reprogramming. They look and act like an embryonic stem cell. But there are no embryos involved. You can take virtually any tissue to start with, people from any age, people with diseases, so you can actually model the disease in the dish. Or adult stem cells, my favorite, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. Next slide. To get embryos, you have to have eggs. And this is an ad that actually appeared in a local DC paper a number of years ago, where, it sounds dramatic, which comes first, the egg or the cure. And you get all of these terrible diseases, but the pitch is we want young women to donate their eggs for stem cell research, to make embryos and then kill them to get the cells. Next slide. And just to summarize in terms of stem cells, we've already mentioned in terms of fetal as well as embryonic, you have to end a human life to get the cells, and they don't actually work in terms of actually helping patients. Even in the research lab, they're not of great utility. Whereas the adult stem cells, so you may get a numerical quiz. I may give a pop quiz being a professor later on. So how many people have been cured using embryonic stem cells? How many people have been cured and helped using adult stem cells? Over 2 million now. And the number keeps growing and growing and growing. Ethically obtained from adults, from umbilical cord blood, the placenta that's cast off after birth. Nobody dies to get adult stem cells. And then the iPS cells I mentioned, where you can take them from the patient themselves, turn them into these embryonic-like stem cells. But again, no one has to die to get these cells. Next slide. And here are a couple of former embryos. This was from a House hearing back in 2001. We were testifying, about the difference between embryonic and adult stem cells and the ethical difference. And Lucinda and John Borden, Lucinda was testifying, she held up this little picture. They had adopted frozen embryos. And she's got a picture of the embryos here under the microscope. And then John stood up with Luke and Mark at his arms and said, "So, Congressman, which one of my sons would you kill for research?" Same individuals, just a few months later, but it made that point. You have to destroy a human life to get the embryonic stem cells. And I was pleased they sent me these pictures of Luke and Mark 18 years later. One's now in the Coast Guard and the other is a policeman in the LA area. Next slide. I mentioned those iPS cells again just to point out that here's a way, an ethical way to get virtually the same identical type of cell. Dr. Shinya Yamanaka from Japan got the 2012 Nobel Prize for coming up with this way to get ethical cells. And when they interviewed him, said, "How did you even come up with this?" He says, "Well, I went into a friend's lab and he showed me these embryos in the microscope, and I thought, there's such a small difference between them and my daughters. We really need to come up with something different." Next slide. So, adult stem cells, though, seem to be the real gold standard when it comes to patients. You can get them from virtually any tissue. Now, we're most familiar with something like cord blood or bone marrow. My favorite is adipose or fat tissue because I can be a donor. Next slide. Umbilical cord, baby's going, "Hey, I used to have something here." But, taken at birth, the solid cord and the cord blood itself has already helped over 35,000 people around the globe. Next slide. This is an older paper where at that point it was only 1.5 million patients who'd been treated. It is now over 2 million. We're kind of waiting for the scientific papers to catch up to the reality. Next slide. But here are some of the people. And there's a website we've put up called stemcellresearchfacts.org. I encourage you to go look at that. What we've tried to do is, instead of me giving you those dry scientific facts, we want the patients to tell their story. So Jackie Stolfus, who had, past tense, lupus, was treated with her own adult stem cells, no longer has lupus, and now has 2 little girls of her own. Reagan Moore is the cutie down here in the lower right. She was born with what's called Krabbe syndrome. It's a neurological genetic condition. These little kids usually don't live past 2 years old. They caught it, diagnosed it at birth. She was treated with adult stem cells from umbilical cord blood. Reagan went to school this past fall. She's now about 5.5, 6 years old. Next slide, please. Some other examples. Allison Carr, treated for multiple sclerosis with her own adult stem cells. She's in remission. This isn't like, we're going to stop progression of the disease and kind of hold you. She's in remission. Richard Burt, a friend of mine, wrote this big fat textbook over here, but he's now training people around the globe to treat patients with these autoimmune diseases with their adult stem cells. Next slide. Desiree had, past tense, sickle cell anemia. She was treated with umbilical cord blood adult stem cells for her sickle cell and remarked that it was the first time she lived without pain, and decided then to go to nursing school so she could help others. Next slide. And little Ileana is the baby here. She was treated in the womb with adult stem cells, and it corrected a genetic problem, so she was born without a particular blood disease. Next slide. You do have to make sure you're using the right stem cell when you treat people. Next slide, please. Okay, a little weirder. Let's talk about things called organoids. Now, these are not just miniaturized organs, but you can take adult stem cells or the iPS cells and make a model of an organ actually in the dish. So not just the cells growing, but it will actually form together. And next slide, you get things like cerebral organoids that actually model brain development and interconnections and so on. It's actually how they figured out how the Zika virus was causing those brain problems that you would see with little babies who'd been infected in the womb. Next slide. You can do things like form model lung tissue with all the little alveoli, the little oxygen sacs that we see in the lungs, using, again, these organoids. They call them mini lungs. They don't really look like a miniature lung, but the function and the way they grow and develop is the same. Heart organoids, so you can study how hearts develop, and also congenital problems with heart development. Next slide. Reprogramming so that you actually will get photoreceptors and development in terms of normal eye or what goes wrong with faulty eye development. Nose organoids, nothing to sniff at there. Oh, yeah. And then tiny tear glands in a dish. And Roy Orbison is on the right there because of his song, Crying, yeah, because they actually made these little things cry in the lab dish. Weird, yes, but it totally modeled the normal system using ethically derived stem cells. Next slide. Okay, and then, okay, it's just gonna get weirder, I confess. But these are things you need to know about because these are actually challenges to the life issue. Next slide, please. And of course, a lot of people think of the mad scientists. I kind of let my hair go here to get that Einstein look. But, in their final year, research students are taught maniacal laughing. Well, mwahaha. But not all scientists are mad or crazy. Next slide. There are some good things that can come here. So in the upper right, what they've done is they actually grew skin from stem cells that had been genetically corrected for a genetic defect. There's a condition called epidermolysis bullosa, in which there's a particular gene that doesn't work, and for these little kids, their skin doesn't stick together. You can't hug them because their skin comes off. And it is a fatal condition eventually. Well, what they did for this one young man, he was about 9 years old, they took some of his skin stem cells, corrected the defect in the lab, grew him some skin, did the skin grafts using the corrected cells, and he's out playing soccer and just being a normal kid now. Gene therapies, still very early on and a lot yet to be done and figured out in terms of that, but a number of different therapies now using genetic therapies. There are some that are good, so let's not paint with too broad a brush here. Next slide. But then there are some that are on the edge. So James Watson, Nobel laureate, if we could make better human beings by knowing how to add genes, why shouldn't we do it? And the question that came to my mind was, who determines what's better? What's a better human being in all of this? Next slide. And so in the upper left, the doctor there with the cap on and so on with the little baby. This is a 3-parent baby. So his idea of trying to help people who might have a particular genetic problem was to create an embryo that had genetic material from 2 women and 1 man. We actually were able to get some legislation passed with some congressmen so that they couldn't do that in the US. So he went to Mexico, where they didn't have a law against it. They're pushing the envelope, trying wherever they can to do not just genetic corrections of people that are already born, but to create genetically modified embryos and people to your own specifications. Next slide. This is a paper out of China where they were looking at genetic editing. And what they actually did, you can't see it because it's off the bottom, but they first made cloned human embryos and then did the genetic modifications. You kind of get a double unethical whammy here, if you will. Next slide. In the upper left, Dr. Ha finally revealed in 2019 that he had genetically edited a couple of little girls as embryos and then gestated them to birth. And he came out, I think he thought he would be celebrated as this great scientist who was going to cure all these diseases. Now, he actually didn't cure them of anything. In fact, his genetic twiddling probably is going to work against them. He thought he was going to help them prevent being infected with the AIDS virus. Didn't seem to work out in terms of their genetics, but it probably did make them more susceptible to flu and West Nile virus, will change their cognition and probably shorten their life. There's a lot of hubris going on here with these scientists, thinking that they can meddle in human genetics from the very beginning. Next slide. And there were calls for a moratorium, and worldwide we ought to stop this sort of stuff, or at least call a pause. The WHO and National Academy of Sciences from the US and other organizations said, yeah, maybe we don't want to stop it. In fact, here are ways that we could foster it. And so they've come up with ways that this will just actually continue. Next slide. So we're looking at the potential then of, pick the characteristics and traits you would like from your child, and the scientist in the lab will program them. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, it's from the 90s called Gattaca, Gattaca. It's about a futuristic society where they're doing just that, if you can afford it. It's not that far in the future now. Next slide. Human-animal chimeras. Okay, this just gets weirder and weirder, I know. The idea here that you're going to mix human and animal genetics and make some sort of hybrid. Technical term is chimera. And one proposal is, we'll just make pigs that'll grow human organs and we'll have lots of things to transplant. The problem is they want to do this early on so that the pigs might make a human heart, but they might also have a human brain or make human eggs or sperm. Next slide. And again, China seems to be on the leading edge, if you will, of this. Monkey embryos containing human genetics. Next slide. The idea that what that says is oocytes from stem cells up at the top, actually creating human eggs and sperm from just stem cells in the dish so that you could make millions and millions of embryos to your design. Next slide. And then do-it-yourself embryos. No eggs, no sperm, none of that cloning stuff. We're just going to mix some stem cells together, get them to come together, make an embryo in the dish of our own design. Embryoid is the term that's sometimes used, but they're a real embryo. And the whole 14-day rule that they're talking about here in the lower right is, for years and years and years, there was sort of this understanding that you shouldn't actually be growing human embryos in the lab and experimenting with them, at least not past 14 days. In the UK, it's a law. It's sort of a suggestion in the US. We back a 0-day rule where you're not creating, manipulating, destroying human embryos at all. Next slide. Our artificial womb. Now, that's not what this is. This is a fancy incubator. where you might be able to take a preemie, extreme preemie, and give them a uterine environment just to let their lungs develop a little bit more. There's some good in terms of that. Next slide. But not in terms of this. There's a scientist in Israel who grew mouse embryos halfway through gestation in these little rotating bottles. You can see on the website, though not here, but on the right, the little hearts are beating. You can see the brains forming, the limbs, and so on. And what the scientist said, I would advocate doing that with human beings. Grow them at least 40 days, do our experiments, and then destroy them. He then formed a company called Renewal Bio, where they plan on doing this and growing them not just 40 days, but even longer, and then harvesting the organs for research or transplant. Next slide. We wrote with Lila Rose this thing, it's a year and a half ago when this was first coming up, that we really need to stop this. It hasn't been stopped anywhere so far. But we really need to put some limits and channel the science into an ethical route. Next slide. And of course, some of the scientists say, well, self-regulation, we know what we're doing, and we're the best ones to make the decision, and there's an idea of self-regulation there in the bottom. Next slide. The International Society for Stem Cell Research is going the other way. They put out recommendations that forget the 14 limit, grow them as long as you want, make these embryo mixes, grow them in the lab, genetically alter them, make human-animal chimeras, and even gestate them. So again, no holds barred. Next slide, please. My colleagues on the lozerinstitute.org website have now put up what we call the Handbook of Nascent Human Beings. There's actually 2 volumes now. The first one gives you an explanation of the science so that you can kind of learn more about this. The second one talks about the actual ethics of making embryoids or clones and so on. So I'd encourage you to go check those out as well. Next slide. So, it's fine, we're doing okay. The hole's on the other end of the boat, right? So we don't have to worry? No, we all have to worry because this is going to affect us. It's going to affect our society. And as pro-lifers, we need to speak up. Next slide. Rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. If you say, behold, we didn't know this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who keeps watch over your soul know it? And will he not requite you according to his work? Thank you.
Thank you, David. You covered a lot of territory. Well done. I know that was drinking out of the fire hose, so to speak. But this is very important stuff, and Anglicans for Life tracks all this. We are on these websites a lot, trying to understand it, keep track of it, because we recognize that the church has to be part of the system of saying no and upholding better standards and ways of doing things. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful you're here and you've shared all your wonderful knowledge with us. I know there's even more in there. All right, so we're going to do Q&A. We've got a question over here. And David, if you wouldn't mind repeating the question so that the virtual audience, just in case, is double getting it. Thanks.
Yeah. My question is about the COVID vaccines, because I understand that they were either tested or developed using fetal tissue. Lines is what they were called. And I found that wording confusing, and I tried to find out what a fetal line was, and I understood that maybe it was something that they took 40 years ago. Can you clarify that and explain what I've put into my body, ended up putting into my body?
The whole question here is about, for the COVID vaccines, and frankly for any vaccine, and use of fetal cell lines. And there's a difference between fetal tissue, those sort of organs and body parts that we're talking about, and the cell line, those pictures of just the little cells there. But the line means a lineage, and so where did they originate? And there are still some of these cell lines from an abortion for each one line that took place, one back in the 1960s, another in the 1970s, one in the 1980s. They're still used in some research labs, and they're still used in some pharmaceutical cases. Now, the good news, we could say, is that most vaccines nowadays don't use those old lines. In fact, Sanofi just switched over their polio vaccine a few years ago from using one of those old fetal cell lines to using something else that's ethically derived. There were some of the COVID vaccines. In fact, we've got a whole chart on our website. We were tracking this in terms of, did they use any, not fetal tissue again, but the fetal cells to design, to produce, or to test those cells. And without going through all of it, I'd encourage you to go to our website and look at the chart. The disappointing thing to us was that a number of vaccines, not just in the US, but around the world, still were trying to use some of those old lines. But there are some that didn't, whether it was in terms of their testing, whether it was in terms of actually making the vaccine. And what we've been trying to do is continue to encourage scientists in the lab and the pharmaceutical companies that, there are better ways to do it. As we were talking about before, there are ethical alternatives, and they're actually better. So I think that's the message that we need to keep putting out there to them, that you need to go to the ethical and successful route. You're welcome.
All right. I am going to do one from the virtual audience. There seems to be discussion and rumors of research on cross-gender transplants of reproductive organs, i.e. putting a womb into a biological male. Do you have any comments? Is this really happening?
There are a few reports that I have seen where they have attempted that. It doesn't work too well. I mean, most of these odd ideas, we'll just call them, that are just contra normal biology, don't work so well. It's probably not a good idea to be doing that anyway. And I think you ought to be considering normal biology and ethical types of things.
All right, thank you. Let's take your question.
I work in a pregnancy care center where I frequently meet with women who use, from the most remote possibility to an actual diagnosis of a fetal anomaly as a justification for abortion. So that I am equipped for the next time I have this conversation, what would be the next step for her in order to connect her to someone who can investigate, is fetal surgery an option for her? And also, is that even a possibility for someone who's on pregnancy Medicaid?
Okay, you're going to repeat the question a little bit, and I'm also going to say that our next speaker is actually going to probably give you a helpful answer as well. Dr. Brokowski is here.
But the question basically is, a lot of times pregnancy help centers get women who come in, and the diagnosis of a fetal anomaly is being used to encourage them to get an abortion. Next steps would be, in a lot of cases, and I don't want to trample on our next speaker, but in a lot of cases, the quotes diagnosis has been made using, instead of a diagnostic test, using a screening test, the maternal blood and so on, which has a fairly high false positive and false negative rate. It very much depends on the characteristics of mom as well. But even if they've then had a diagnostic test, those are not 100% accurate. So the question then is, where from here? Is there a possibility of fetal surgery? That would be, basically you're going to have to refer them to one of these places that has a fetal maternal unit for more consultation. There are going to be some conditions that's not an option. And so then it's a matter really of perinatal hospice as a particular option, things like this. I might just say there are a number of studies that show women who have gone through that abortion versus doing something like perinatal hospice or other alternatives tend to have more mental health problems. So, trying to steer them to a life affirming, even if that little one only lasts, a few hours. I've got some friends who went through that, and life affirming is still the way to go for all involved.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Jean?
Hi. What are your thoughts on the adoption of frozen embryos? So you mentioned it in your talk. Are there any ethical considerations for people who want to grow their family that way, given that they come from in vitro fertilization, which has ethical concerns?
Yeah, and so the question is my opinions and thoughts and whatever on adopting frozen embryos. We'd mentioned Luke and Mark Borden in the talk. I know there is some ethical hesitancy depending on people's background and so on. And I understand that. My basic thing is we're dealing with a life that's already here. It's not a matter of how they were conceived, and we can spend time discussing that and the ethical issues with that, but now you've got a life there. And I see a lot of those little freezers as little frozen orphanages. I don't think adopting those frozen embryos is or should be viewed as an encouragement for more IVF, just so that more embryos can be adopted. But I do think we need to consider those lives that are already there and care for them as much as we can.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead over there. Go ahead.
Hello, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm very excited to go home and tell my son about it. He's going off to college and is very excited about doing research and things like this. And I know there are probably a lot of young people who are also really excited to go into sciences and make a difference and do these things. At the same time, I think we can all think of like high-profile Christians in places like the NIH who maybe have made some ethical compromises. What is your word of encouragement to young people looking to go into this field in terms of remaining faithful and keeping their sights centered and not losing track and kind of going off course?
So the question is about young people who are going off and want to go into research, and how do they keep their center? How do they keep their anchor in faith? And I think they need to keep continually reminding themselves, what's bedrock for me in terms of my faith? And, there's no conflict, frankly, between science and religion. It's a matter of how the science is applied. It comes back to that early slide I showed where, there are ethical ways to do these various things. And the young person simply also needs to be, though, discerning about, hey, if I'm going to go work in this lab, maybe make a little inquiry beforehand. What kind of research are you doing and so on? If there's no choice, I've had young folks come to me and say, I'm working in this lab and I find out they're using embryonic stem cells as part of the research. Go to your major advisor, go to your prof and just say, I've got some real ethical issues with that. Is there another project I can work on? In almost every case I know of, that's happened. As well as in some pharmaceutical companies, people who didn't want to be associated with certain areas. So I think there's actually a good promise there, and I would strongly encourage our young folks to go into research and be a light in that forum.
Okay, we're going to ask another one from our virtual audience. Are there common medical treatments of which we should be aware of so as to avoid them that by their very nature imply a questionable ethical standard? Maybe a good example is the implanting of the pig valve in a heart.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the question is, are there common medical procedures that we ought to be aware of? There's an ethical problem or there isn't. And Georgette mentioned the pig heart valve. There's really no ethical problem there. We're not making you into a pig person by doing that. You're not going to all of a sudden decide that you really like cornmeal a lot. Yeah, that's not a problem. The other thing I hear is there were a couple of things I'd seen on the internet about fetal tissue or fetal cells had been used for all of these various common drugs like Tylenol and so on. That's simply false. I mean, think about aspirin. Aspirin was first developed in the 1860s. Fetal cell lines didn't exist until the 1960s and 70s. You didn't use fetal cells to develop aspirin or anything like that. I think the question is, for some of these things, it's to ask your doc, where was this drug derived? Or, the common, you see the ads on TV all the time they're called monoclonal antibody drugs, Keytruda and some other things like that. Ask your doc. Just say, look, do you have like the printout, as to how this is made? Because the FDA puts all of that stuff up on their website. You can get it in an actual understandable form, somewhat English involved there, to look. And if you have a question, give us a call. We'll help you through it.
All right. That's why I call him all the time. All right. We're running out of time, so a quick question here and a quick answer there.
Okay.
One of the things you see in other countries right now is, I think it's like the Netherlands, is this movement to abort babies who are born with genetic deficiency, Down syndrome, all these different things. Do you see that movement coming to the United States? And, obviously there's major ethical concerns with that, right?
Yeah.
But, it's growing. It's a growing movement in a lot of other countries. Do you see that coming to the United States? And do you see some of these companies that are on kind of the cutting edge of technologies to edit genes playing a role in that debate?
So kind of a two-parter. The main thing being, the trend, certainly in some other countries, Iceland, Denmark, to abort babies if they have Down syndrome or any sort of fetal anomaly. Is it coming to the U.S.? And the other thing being, in some of the new sort of gene editing companies, are they in with this? Is this a good thing for them? Unfortunately, I think there is a trend in the U.S. to do that, whether it's because of fetal anomaly. Sex selection abortions actually happen in the U.S. We hear it most because, these inequalities in China or India where they were aborting girl babies so they could have more boy babies and have an heir. But you see the same sort of thing in the U.S. In fact, there are a couple of websites where you can determine the gender of your child by about 6 to 10 weeks for family balancing. So it is here. We've actually testified, my colleagues and I, on some bills to prohibit gender discrimination and any sort of prenatal discrimination for those little babies. The genetic engineering folks, I don't think, are too much into that, but some of these tests that I mentioned before, where you can diagnose using maternal blood, they're screening tests. They're not all that accurate, especially if just applied across the board. And people need to be very cautious about those things. Even if you get a positive back, there's a diagnostic test that needs to take place after that. And then people need to consider, what's my future?
Okay. And the last question, we're going to wrap up.
Sure. So my question relates to all of this genetic editing stuff. I'm wondering, one, how effective is it? So we're seeing all these experiments, whether that's in China when they're being called rogue doctors. So one, are these experiments actually working, whether that's with pigs and human organs? Two, what is the general consensus in the medical community right now in terms of that stuff? Because you see some people say that he's just a rogue doctor doing this thing. So what is the medical consensus? And then what is the ETA on all of this stuff kind of coming to fruition, where you see, like a pig human embryo, hybrid walking down the street or whatever. So when is, in say 20 years, what do you foresee?
Yeah, so how successful is the gene editing research right now in actually treating anybody? What's the consensus in the medical community about it? And how soon or when we might see some of this actually come to fruition? It's not all that accurate at this point. There's a lot of research that's being done. It's a little more accurate now than it was 10, 20 years ago when people were first excited about gene editing or genetic engineering and so on. but there's a lot of work to be done to make it successful. There are a few hits now. I mentioned a few up there, and there are some suggestions that maybe things like sickle cell anemia or some other diseases might be coming in terms of using the gene editing. The medical community is kind of mixed right now in terms of that. There's not a consensus. There's an excitement about the possibility, but most docs would still kind of like to see some proof that this is actually going to work. And so everybody's sort of waiting. And, you know, how soon are you going to see meet your clone walking down the street or the pig man or whatever? I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.